in the whole theory of man's spiritual growth, all growth arose from the unfoldment of personal integrity. The beginning of all mystical discipline was the purification of the individual's life. Purification did not mean to imply that the individual could get nowhere unless he was spotless. Purification meant that the search for reality had to be genuine. It had to be real. It had to represent a dedication to principle. It certainly had to mean that the common difficulties which beset us have to be met and understood and fulfilled according to the workings of law. So we have today a great many people who are trying desperately to develop certain extrasensory perceptions. Most of them get in trouble. They get in trouble for many reasons. First, because they do not understand how to develop anything. They have to hope. They have to pray. They have to follow some strange, mysterious pattern and have some kind of faith that it will work. Many times, of course, they are following patterns given them by others. And here we frequently hear the wonderful accounts of the secret instructions that folks have received. And many of these instructions are appalling. They represent the most colossal ignorance and effrontery on someone's part. I've checked a great many of these wonderful revelations of how to develop extrasensory powers, how to become an adept in 5 or 10 lessons, how to look through solid walls and see what's going on the other side, how to multiply the family fortune, make friends, influence people, dominate situations, almost anything you want. But even apart from these, which some folks are a little too smart to fall for anymore, there are these mysterious procedures which are supposed to be shortcuts to the infinite, by which the individual is all the quicker and the more simply directed to some type of illumination or mystical experience. I have tracked down a great many of them. Sometimes they're in pamphlets and literature, sometimes they're carefully guarded secrets, communicated only from one person to another under the most direful obligations. But where did they come from in the first place? Where do these instructions originate? And I have checked a great many of them, and nearly all of them begin in somebody else's psychical aberration. That is the 100% causing ground for most of them. You finally get the individual who apparently was the pioneer in this particular form of the matter. You pin them down as to where they got this secret discipline that was to save the world. Who told them? What secret or ancient society did they belong to? Where was the line of descent on this knowledge? Where did the information come from? In almost every instance, this information was something that had been given to them in a dream, in a nightmare, in a bad moment of some kind. Often it was nothing but a slightly twisted paraphrase of something they had read. But they hadn't consciously taken this thing they had read and passed it on as their own. They really hadn't. But they had been reading about it for some time, and one night they dreamt about it. And it got a few extra flourishes in the processes of the dream, and the next morning a new religion was born. And this is how it started. And people, quite convinced of the sincerity of the source, and the person at the beginning probably actually rather sincere. Everybody in trouble within 6 months. Because the situation was not bona fide, there was nothing. The only way in which the individual could get anywhere with the instructions he was receiving was to develop so powerful an imagination that he had hallucinations of progress relating to himself. He could imagine himself to be illuminated. In fact, if he was real good at it, he could have a dream somewhere also, in which the cosmos opened up and he found himself seated in the midst of the infinite. But the whole thing ended up in a dream. It ended up in a strange, negative, psychic situation. Well, you can say if it made the person happy and didn't do anybody else any harm, and everyone seemed to be getting along a little better than they had before, why upset the apple cart? If that's what they want to believe, if we live in a land where you can believe almost anything you want, why not let them go on believing? Well, if it went along nicely like this and everything remained happy, that wouldn't be perhaps so bad a situation. But it never goes that way. In a very short time, the false doctrines, the false ideas, the stupid situations that arise begin to create complications. The individual who thinks he is illumined insists on illuminating other people. He doesn't know much himself, and by the time it passes on to a number of others, it's worse than when he got it. He begins to have pre-warning of various events. He frightens people to death. He has visions of what is going to happen to the universe, the political system, and the neighborhood. This becomes very complicated. And also, little by little, he becomes a metaphysical aristocrat on his own part. There is this note of infallibility about him. After he's had this a little while, he loses his family, his relatives, and his friends, who cannot put up with this concept of an infallible person who is making as many mistakes as he ever made, but isn't admitting them anymore. The individual suddenly discovers, or doesn't discover, but others discover for him, that he has stepped out of the stream of life's experience. He has new and fancy meanings for everything that happens. These meanings are no longer of any use to him in helping him to grow. As one individual told me, he said, "Why should I experience how to grow? I've already reached perfection." It's a marvelous way to feel about things. But as far as this person was concerned, they were the only one who had the slightest suspicion that they had reached perfection. This same person who was perfect was the same grand old gossip they'd ever been. This person had the same antagonisms, the same prejudices, the same fanaticisms that they had always had. Their temper was just as bad as ever. The only difference is that they had the same faults, but now they were blind to them, and this is no improvement. Or, as one individual explained to me, who had a certain rather bad dispositional problem that they had worked with for a number of years before they had become illuminated, I asked them how they were getting along with this old problem that they had been fighting with for years, and they looked at me rather scornfully and assured me that a nasty temper was one of the proofs of advancement. How foolish can you get? And they believed it. Little by little, all perspective was gone. Now, this isn't helpful. The individual keeps on going along this way until a situation arises in which they come face to face with an emergency in which the only solution would lie in the fact they were what they thought they were. that they did possess sufficient insight and understanding to solve a major issue. When this emergency arises, the issue is not solved because they haven't what it takes to solve it. Sometimes there is a very bitter disillusionment. It's a horrible thing to suddenly wake up and realize you've been studying for 20 years something that isn't so. Very discouraging. Also, that in the moment when all these things were supposed to produce their miracles, nothing happened. There are these bitter and painful experiences. And we see that the person who starts off on one of these tangents never knows where he's going to end. Unfortunately, too many of them end with mental breakdowns. They have become so involved, so tied up, they can't possibly solve the situation. Another painful interlude that most of these persons come in contact with is the fact that they are so right and nobody else sees it. This is very unfortunate. They know that they are creatures of destiny, but the world won't accept them. Under such pressure as this, they become antisocial, turn against the world. They feel that they are being persecuted simply because they're not agreed with. This can get to be a very serious source of mental and emotional stress. Almost everything that arises from these false, basic attitudes become in turn. Almost everything that arises from these false, basic attitudes taking the life away from the simple dignities, the simple humanities that make things valuable. If, therefore, you are not careful, you can get into trouble. Here's another general phase of the matter which also has its problems, and that is the effect upon health. We've spoken about a little about the emotional and mental stress of these situations. Now let's speak about the physical. The possible damage that is done physically as a result of some of these procedures. Nearly all metaphysical practices involve a certain amount of stress. They create various kinds of fixed tensions of one kind or another. Most forms of concentration will do this in time. The individual, whether he realizes it or not, subjects his nervous system, particularly the autonomic system, to a tremendous amount of stress. The moment the confusion is set up in our relationships with life, the nervous system begins to flutter. Because the nervous system is very close to fear, anxiety, uncertainty, unreasonable hope, and the ups and downs of 1 minute of despair and the next minute of exaltation, the individual believing everything one moment and nothing the next moment, more or less disoriented much of the time, and becoming more and more hypersensitive, more and more defensive, because he is increasingly misunderstood by everybody else. Little by little, his life becomes miserable, unhappy, unadjusted, tension-ridden, stress-torn. And in a very reasonable length of time, the physical situation begins to reveal itself. It is very hard for the person to be under fear, anxiety, or intense imagination without punishing the bodily structure too much. So these people begin to experience lack of normal body functions. Respiration may become erratic. Various forms of tachycardia may develop. Elimination may get very bad. And most of all, we have the person who develops what I have often referred to as psychic flutters. This is an ailment in itself which is almost uniquely due to psychosomatic symbolism. It is the gradual development within the personality of strange, unexplainable miseries, as we used to call them, particularly in the Deep South. They were often referred to as miseries, sometimes a little further north as agonies. But in any case, they were difficulties. Most persons who have these psychic problems report strange feelings. They report motions moving inside of them, something like nerve filaments crawling under the skin. They describe something resembling the grand symbolism of the metaphors. Almost any mysterious, eccentric, uncomfortable, distressing feeling. They will have all the cold chills and hot flashes there are in the book. They will feel things moving up and down their spines, think their eyes are crossed, have trouble in swallowing, strange, mysterious moving migraines in various parts of the body. They will develop symptoms of arthritis one moment and of arteriosclerosis the next. They haven't any of them. But they are suffering from palpitations, flutterations, and everything you can think of. And they are sure, almost certain, that these different things all indicate the presence of some kinds of strange entities that are creeping up at them when they're not looking, scratching them when they're trying to relax, whispering unpleasant words into their ears when they're trying to sleep, tormenting their rest with dreams and visions that are not nice and not pleasant, and creating every kind of a nerve reflex that people do not enjoy. This is a very common group of symptoms. I could list hundreds of related symptoms in this area, but I think we have summed it up sufficiently to point out the general theme. To these people, all of these symptoms seem to signify the presence of some other entity, being, force, nature, or substance affecting them. Perhaps they think that some of these mysterious feelings are other people's thoughts bouncing off of them, or something. But as always, this type of thing begins to develop. I think the real answer to it is a gradual psychosomatic transference of total confusion. The individual has lost completely orientation. And perhaps we can imagine that the nervous system, under such complete psychic breakdown, simply loses its own rhythms and its own orderly processes, and begins to take on some similitude of the prevailing lack of organization and integration. In any event, we find that a large amount of psychic phenomena ends up with this. Sometimes it gets so bad that there seems to be very little you can do for it. The one thing that might help you can't do in the majority of instances, and that is get the individual to change his own mental habits. By this time he is so convinced that he has no power over the situation that all he wants is a sorcerer to get rid of demons for him. He doesn't have any realization that these symptoms indicate the breakdown of his own natural integration. He is not mentally ill. He is physically disturbed, symbolically. All the mysterious doubts and wonders and hopes and anxieties that developed psychically are now playing themselves out nervously in the functions of the body. And this is an unpleasant thing to have happen. And the moment anybody feels any of these symptoms, stop worrying about what other people are doing to you and start organizing your own resources as quickly as you can. By organizing your own resources, I mean simply get your mind on practical, workable levels of action, train your thinking, control your emotions, find natural and reasonable outlets, and get your mind off of being spiritual. Because if you don't, you're going to have more trouble. Obviously, an individual in this condition is not spiritual. Therefore, whatever method has been used to get into trouble is not the method they should be following if they wish to become wise. So there's no use continuing the present policy. It is obviously wrong, or the individual wouldn't be in trouble all the time. This, again, is a problem that affects good people. People who have tried very hard, but who have lost a certain sense of security. They have been thrown out into a universe that is too big for them, and they weren't smart enough to swim to shore as quickly as possible. And most of these people must learn to swim to shore and to start all over again in the effort to establish a basic groundwork for self-improvement. We often find that other factors do contribute to this situation. Nearly every religious organization and most people involved in them become gradually more or less unnatural in their personal ways of living. They get into trouble this way also, unfortunately. We have all kinds of trick diets. We have all kinds of special exercises. We have individuals forcibly removed or deprived of the common expressions of life which have been theirs over a period of years. We find them gradually developing various frustrations on the ground that the more frustrated they are, the more spiritual they are. This is a good way to get good and sick quick, because the human being cannot take these inconsistent procedures without having some background for them. Now, it is true that every so often you will find a hermit or an old saint in legend, lore, or actual history, perhaps, who has gone away into the desert, into the mountains, or into the forest, and there built his hermitage, and has lived peacefully and quietly apart from the concerns of man, and has practiced his Tao or his Zen or his Yoga for half a lifetime in perfect peace and tranquility. Nothing unfortunate ever happened to him so far as we know, but sometimes we're not quite sure how far we know. But at the same time, the rumors are that he's done well. Now, this is all right. It's quite understandable. There are people like this in every human society. There are individuals who are born for the cloisters and are never happy till they go there. There are people who have always wanted to live strange lives of unselfish dedication to other people. They're really most content in some field of religious service. They have no strong attachments to worldliness. They find material living uncomfortable and unpleasant. They do not want to run away into doing nothing, so they would rather live in a dedicated service to some cause. And many of these people are very useful, and they do wonderful jobs. but they are generally useful and do well under the strong supervision of a system, and they become teachers of the young, or nurses of the sick, or guardians of the aged, or something of this nature. But they live and function, and their religious life is dedicated to rather practical, commonplace labors, which they perform in the name of their higher spiritual ideals. This, in many instances, works out very well. But to take everyone, to take people from here and there and everywhere, and impose these kind of restrictions on them, will most certainly end in psychological and probably physical disorder. These people are not so constituted that such a program is reasonable or practical for them. This is what happened in the development of Buddhism, where the southern school divided from the northern school. The southern school taught distinctly and definitely that there was only one way to achieve illumination, and that was to leave the world completely, utterly, and immediately, and never come back again. To turn from the common life to the robe, to give up every possession, to give up every attachment, to give up every worldly attitude and even every worldly responsibility, and go out with a begging bowl and one small square of cloth, and keep on wandering and meditating until consciousness or death ended the procedure. This was not, however, the Buddhism that gradually unfolded the great arts, the great cultures, the great mystics and idealists of the Mahayana system. Man gradually came to realize that somehow the great spiritual truths had to be brought within the range of his common life. It became necessary for him to think of the way of liberation for the householder, that the father and mother with children and family and business had to have their part in this great pattern of enlightenment, that it wasn't to leave everything and to depart into the unknown, but in some mysterious way to increase in grace, insight, and understanding every day, to find in the commonplace the source of enlightenment and inspiration, and also to realize that for the majority of mankind, simple idealistic devotion to principles was the wisest and best way to grow. That sometimes, if the person had the internal requisites, if he had brought forward with him from some previous life a degree of insight that called for the development of some extrasensory perception, it would come in due time of itself. And of course, in the northern Buddhist system, that was the last thing anybody asked for or expected. They did not practice their religion in the hopes that some initiation or mystical experience would occur to them. They practiced their religion because they believed that their religion was the proper way of life, that if they lived this and lived it well and kept the law, they would fulfill their responsibility to God and themselves. The whole purpose underlying this religious philosophy was not the unfoldment of the individual primarily. It was obedience to the law, the glorification of truth by keeping its rules and principles, and keeping them unselfishly, not in hope of enlightenment, but because this was the proper labor of an enlightened human being. Under such conditions, we do know that there were mystics, and great mystics arise among these different groups. But these mystics were persons who had slowly unfolded. They had lived each step of the common life. They had grown skillful and wise in the philosophy of the doctrine. They had gone out and dedicated themselves to the service of others over long periods of time. They had gained practical insight as working with the sick and as helping to solve the problems of the burdened. They had become the counselors of rulers and the friends of princes. They had helped in the creation of good laws. They had helped to perfect arts and sciences. Many of them actually gave skills to their peoples. And Kobodaishi, who was one of the great monks of the Shingon-shu in Japan, is accredited with having given almost as many inventions to the Japanese people as Leonardo da Vinci gave to Europe. A tremendous genius in his own right. He was not a person who had simply decided to be spiritual. He had worked and labored and studied. He had lived with the wise. He made the long and at that time dangerous journey to China in order to come closer to the great seats of the doctrines. He was a master of knowledge, one of the most perfectly informed men of his time, and still regarded as one of the most enlightened men of Asia. These people grew sincerely. They gave everything they had to growth. And they grew not just simply for the sake of being wise themselves, but that they might become the founders of essential and practical movements and organizations. They were great mathematicians, great artists, great musicians, poets, men of literature and letters. And out of the temples and the shrines and the sanctuaries came the great arts, the great modelings and sculpturings, the casting in bronze and in silver. These people were highly skilled. They took the attitude that the more able they became in everyday labor, the more completely they were able to express their spiritual convictions. So that they worked with the law. They became better, realizing that the reward of being better is to know more. The reward of greater daily virtue is enlightenment. That there are really no tricks in this thing at all. By the time they reached the point, as in Zenshu or in the Shingon-shu or Tendai-shu, where certain esoteric disciplines were recommended or given to them by their teachers, these disciples were so well grounded in every principle of ethics, in their knowledge of the universal structure and the operations of all the laws of nature, that it would be virtually impossible for them to make a mistake. They had all the groundwork in, all the principles thoroughly established. Usually, in Zen, not much of an esoteric nature was divulged under 20 years of discipleship. And that discipleship was more rigorous than anything that we can imagine. It was constant self-analysis, the breaking down of every illusion and delusion in consciousness. And by the time the disciple was ready to go on, he had truly cleaned his own inner life. It was well disciplined and well ordered. People that have this degree of insight can probably be trusted, and you seldom if ever hear of anyone in this type of level of activity who ever perverted what he knew or contributed to the corruption of anyone else. These people knew, and they were able to use their knowledge wisely. What we are worried about constantly and stricken about so often is the dabbler, the one who really tries, but simply doesn't even have a comprehension of what he's trying. To him, a few lessons and a couple of books, and he's well on his way to nirvana. It just doesn't operate that way. This does not mean, however, that the individual cannot grow. He can grow continuously. But he has to grow with a dedication, not an enthusiasm alone. He has to grow along the line which is the most difficult of all forms, and that is self-discipline and self-control. I know more people who have tried to be spiritual without taking hold of their own lives. They can do almost anything you can imagine except what they should be doing, and that is controlling and directing their own conduct.